I guess to get started, a bit for a bit of an overview about the interview. So we learned a lot about your contributions on in your focus on reducing and eliminating risk from nuclear weapons. And so we got very interested in seeing your work in that, and also just learning about more about you. And I guess for the audience, for those watching this interview, for those who do not know, Dr. Mian, he's a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security, also known as the SGS. He's also co-chair of the international panel on Fissile Materials, directors of the SGS program of a project on peace and security in South Asia, and was recently appointed to the UN Secretary General's Advisory Board. And so with all of these contributions, Dr. Mian is an important player in nuclear science and politics, and not only in Princeton, but in the world. And it is a pleasure to be interviewing you today.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria. You're very kind. I don't believe that I'm an important player, though I think that that's an overstatement.
Oh.
No, you definitely are, based on our research. So I think, so we have 3 main goals for the interview. Firstly, it's to understand Princeton's involvement in nuclear science and its effects on indigenous groups. And then we want to gain more context around SGS and their goals and their works with indigenous communities and how they can improve. And then lastly, to learn more just about you. And so yeah, I think we can start asking the questions now, Maria. So.
Yeah, so I guess to start getting into it. So as I mentioned before, we were very interested in your work specifically with the Science and Global Security program, and specifically the impact they have made in spreading awareness and Princeton's role in the nuclear physics and Manhattan project. And so with that, we were wondering what initially got you interested in nuclear arms control research and overall your position at the SGS.
So thank you. There is a school of thought that believes that a lot of the work we do are issues of our autobiography playing themselves out. So in my case, I was your age in college in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, studying physics. And this was a time where what we called the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was becoming especially intense. The Cold War was not a constant level of coldness, if I can put it that way. There were moments of very intense crisis, and there were moments where both sides were trying to behave as if they were more restrained and responsible, given the dangers that their enormous nuclear arsenals held by the United States and its allies and by the Soviet Union, and the threat that these arsenals pose to humankind. And so during the 1970s, for a large part of that, there was a period of what was called détente, where the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies, especially in Europe, were trying to show that they could be responsible. And but following a series of events in the late 1970s, and especially the coming to power of President Reagan in the United States and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK and some others in Europe, and the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the Iranian Revolution of 1979, I seem to be getting a lot of
I can mute myself, so in case if there's a lot of background noise.
So the historical background is to basically to show that by that time of the late 1970s and the early 80s, a new era of more aggressive politics was starting to emerge. And so the peace movement became especially concerned about the threat of nuclear war in these circumstances. And you have to remember, I mean, we are seeing the world now through the Russian war against Ukraine and the United States and its allies helping Ukraine against Russia. Back then, the Soviet Union had sent its military into Afghanistan. And the United States and its allies were helping the Afghan resistance by supplying weapons and training and these kinds of things, much in the way that it's doing now with Ukraine to fight against the Soviet Union. And so at that time, naturally, for a variety of reasons, including this, there was increased hostility between these superpowers, as they were called. And so the peace movement was trying to help people understand the really great danger when you have crisis and war involving great powers with nuclear weapons, how this could lead to a terrible catastrophe. And so people would ask about nuclear weapons. And they said, well, you're studying physics, you know, what are all of these new weapons? And, you know, how bad would it be? But they don't teach that in physics courses. They teach you the physics of how the universe works, and atoms and, you know, electrons and nuclei and so on. But they don't necessarily have courses on nuclear weapons or missiles or, you know, what are the effects of nuclear war? And so when people would ask, I would say, I don't know the answer to that question. But it led me to go out and try and find out some answers by reading the literature and trying to understand. And then once you know, then you have to ask the question, well, what do I do with this knowledge that I have, right? So first of all, you can try and answer people's questions. But then is that all you can do, or is there more that you can do? What about people who don't even know to ask the questions? Can you actually talk to them and say, here are some things you should be thinking about if you're not thinking about them already? And then when you have these big public protests, the question is, should you join? Should you join local groups that are trying to make a difference? And so one of the things that happens is that what we now call civil society or social justice movements play an important role in creating a political climate within which ordinary people, individuals, can be given an opportunity to make choices about how they see the world and how they see their role and relationship to it. And this is an enormously important role that political activists and social justice activists play for everybody. And we saw the same thing with the civil rights movement. We see the same thing with the women's movement. We see the same thing with Black Lives Matter and other movements today, because they pose profound and important political questions to their society at that time. And you have to then think about it or decide that you're going to close your eyes and close your ears. But then it's a choice that you have to make. You can't just pretend that nothing is going on. And so this process of bringing these issues into the public consciousness is a central contribution that activism makes. And so in my case, you know, over a period of years, this public activism, you know, about nuclear weapons led me and many other people at that time to ask questions about what are nuclear weapons for? Who gets to decide about nuclear weapons? You know, how many, what kind, what do they do? When would they be used? What would their effects be? Are we willing to live with that kind of idea that this is how you can defend yourself and your society by, you know, what we would now call weapons of mass destruction? And these are not questions that most people think about most of the time. And it's at times of crisis and because of political activists and social movements that these questions get pushed into the foreground. And then people are given the opportunity to try and think about that. And so that led me to begin to think about nuclear weapons. And eventually over time, I decided how I felt about these and how I thought about them. And I became involved in various kinds of organized activities around nuclear weapons, and you know, including in Britain and then in South Asia and then in the United States, and that's always been part of the work that I do. And I was just very fortunate that I was able to find a program at Princeton which had been created in the 1970s by an earlier generation of scientists who had gone through similar experiences over other issues. And I found that you could actually have a career doing research and writing and scholarship and teaching and doing this kind of work on these kinds of issues. And so that was how my career and my interest kind of came together. But unfortunately, there are not many programs like the one that we have at Princeton. They only exist on this issue in a few universities. But I think that these kinds of programs are very important in creating spaces for people to think about how they can do this work of combining scholarship and teaching and engagement with real world issues at the time in the best way that they can.
Okay, I see. As a follow-up, so you're very involved in, like, science and global security and also the International Panel of Fissile Materials. And during your involvement, like, did it ever cross your mind about the effects that nuclear weapons or science has had on the indigenous groups?
So thank you for that question. So I actually teach a first-year seminar, like the one that you're taking from Professor Morimoto. Mine is called Living in a Nuclear-Armed World. And I've been teaching it for more than 10 years now, about 15 years, I think. And part of that course deals with the fact that nuclear weapons are not just physical objects. Weapons are physical objects, after all, in most cases, but that they are involved in institutions and ideas and societies and in the world. And so they have impacts on all of those things. So as part of this course, for a very long time now, I've been having these discussions with students through the readings about how having nuclear weapons in the world means that we have to train people to use them and train people to build them and train people to explain them. And that the process of making the materials out of which nuclear weapons are produced, especially the nuclear materials, the highly enriched uranium and the plutonium, which are the materials that release the energy that power the nuclear explosion, that the uranium has to be mined from the ground, and that has enormous environmental consequences. And similarly, when you take that uranium and you put it into a nuclear reactor, that has all kinds of risks of accidents and other dangers to workers and communities and to the environment. And that when you then have nuclear waste, where are you going to put it? And how long will you be contaminating societies and the land and the environment into the future? And that decisions have to be made about all of these things, and then who gets to decide. And as part of that, we do look at the effects of the nuclear age, not just at the level of countries and leaders with nuclear weapons arguing and threatening, but how it affects ordinary people, including indigenous people. And so we look at the effects, for example, of uranium mining on Native American communities in the United States, and the terrible legacies that have had. And one of the books that we use is a book specifically about the effects of uranium mining on Native communities and the struggle that these communities had, where when the US government came to them and said, look, we want to mine uranium on your land, they didn't tell them about the effects of uranium mining and how hazardous it would be to the people who were doing the mining. But for many Native American communities, these mines offered jobs to their young people, especially to their young men, which would keep them in their communities. And these jobs were actually relatively well paid compared to the other kinds of jobs that they might be able to get unless they had to leave their community, their reservations to go work in the city or work far away. And so there was this terrible set of choices that communities were presented by, but they weren't fully informed of those choices. And so we explore that dimension of that. We also look at the effects of uranium, of the testing of nuclear weapons, because the place in the world which has had the largest number of nuclear explosions in one place is actually the land of the Western Shoshone Nation in Nevada. More nuclear bombs have gone off there than anywhere else in the world. And that community has been in struggle for a long time about the damage that has been done to their land. But similarly, the other countries with nuclear weapons have tested nuclear weapons, often on the land of indigenous people that have been colonized by them, the British and the French and the Chinese and the Russians and so on. And in all of these cases, there has been a terrible effect on local indigenous communities of the effects of these nuclear weapons, because as far as the countries doing the nuclear testing and their leaders, these were far away places. I mean, it wasn't that they were what they would recognize as their country. And as far as they were concerned, these were places without large populations because there weren't big cities. There wasn't a Washington, D.C. or a New York or a London or a Paris or a Moscow or a Beijing. They were far away and they thought, oh, this is a desert, or this is an island in the ocean, as if there were no people and no nature. These empty spaces as far as they were concerned, which is the same way that the Europeans thought of a large part of the world, that because they didn't live there, they thought it was empty and desolate. And so they treated these places as empty places far away where they could explode these nuclear weapons and do enormous damage to indigenous communities. So we explore all of these issues. And at SGS, we actually have projects that we try and support and work with, looking at, in our own small way, the effects of nuclear testing on indigenous communities and on the effects of uranium mining on some of the indigenous communities in the United States. But I mean, this is an enormously large problem with a very, very long history. And one of the things that we can do is to support the effort to raise its visibility in the eyes of the community of people who work on these issues and of the next generation of students who are interested in thinking about this, so that they don't see it only as a problem of international relations or as a problem of political science or of security studies, but of things that happen in the real world to real people and their communities and their land and their livelihoods. And so this is a long, slow process of doing research and teaching and trying to understand and help. But let me add two more things, if I might. It's important to remember that nuclear weapons don't just affect indigenous communities. The people that have been harmed by nuclear weapons include the people who worked in the factories that made nuclear weapons and worked with nuclear weapon material, who are often, in the case of the United States, white American male workers. I mean, they were exposed to radioactivity and to chemical poisons and other kinds of dangers, which they didn't really understand because they thought they were doing something really important for their defense of their country. And it was only much later that they realized that they were exposed to great hazards and got very sick, and some of them died, and some of them have been struggling for many years to have compensation for the cancers and other illnesses caused to them by by their work. And the same has happened in other countries also. And so, and similarly, the military personnel who worked in nuclear weapons, including at the nuclear weapon test sites, they were also exposed to radioactivity, and often they weren't told, because for the military, they wanted to be able to have soldiers and sailors and others who could keep fighting in a nuclear war, even when nuclear weapons were going off. So you can actually see film of soldiers training while nuclear weapons are going off, right? And they were trained to run up and into their radiation fields as if somehow that was what the next war was going to be like. And so they would get exposed to radioactivity, and some of them got sick, and some of them died, and some of them are still struggling for recognition. And the last thing is that even the people who didn't get physically sick, and their homes and their communities didn't get poisoned by the waste and materials associated with the production of nuclear weapon materials and so on, there is a psychological and cultural effect that creates trauma and moral injury to people when they realize what's being done to them. And so you can find in the stories of people who worked in the nuclear weapons complexes as administrators and others, that when they realized just what it was they were doing, planning the mass murder of millions and millions of people, that it actually affected them in ways that they couldn't have imagined. And so all kinds of people in all kinds of circumstances actually are affected by just living in the nuclear age, some more than others, but we're all affected by this. And part of the course tries to help students understand that there are many, many ways of looking at this, including looking at the choice between spending so much money on nuclear weapons when you could have spent it on other things, like healthcare and education and environmental protection and so on. That was a price that was paid by not choosing those as your priorities, where the priority was given to nuclear weapons instead. So that was a cost that others had to pay. And so part of all of this is to say that when we think about nuclear weapons at SGS, we try and think about it in as many dimensions as we can. But we are also limited by our age and our training. And so, there are things that we don't know about, and things that we've only learned now that we couldn't have thought about, 30, 40, 50 years ago. When the program started in the early 1970s, many of the things we now know about the effects of nuclear weapons on people and land and nature and culture and society, people didn't really understand this. And so it's an evolving understanding, and that's part of the thing that universities can contribute to. And young people can contribute to, which is opening up questions and saying, well, what else might be going on? What are the other things that might be being affected? And this is where bringing in new perspectives and new voices helps a lot. Because if we could get more people from more diverse backgrounds into the conversation about nuclear weapons, then they might actually bring new insights that would not occur to the other people that have not had those kinds of experiences or perspectives to bring. And so it's a constant effort to try and expand our own understanding of these kinds of issues. We can't claim that, we sit on top of the mountain and can see all the land and every direction around us. Clearly, we can't. We're just climbing the mountain in the fog, and we're hoping that we will meet other travelers who will tell us the story of the path that they have taken up the same mountain in their own way, so that we can understand better together what is the shape of this mountain and the thing that we're all trying to do together.
Yes, thank you so much for that great response. I think you mentioned something of how the SGS, because something we're wondering about is how organizations in particular, like Princeton, the SGS, or like even bigger ones, can contribute to how they can, like, what responsibilities do they have in providing support for like communities that were affected. And specifically for our freshman seminar course, we are learning specifically about like Indigenous communities and how they were affected, and like the adverse health impacts that uranium mining and all this stuff has had on them, and also with their homelands, how, for instance, like Princeton lays on the homeland of an Indigenous tribe that was here before and was kind of pushed away for like nuclear science and things like that. So like with all of these impacts, something that we were really interested in how like the responsibilities, I said, that Princeton SGS has. And I think you did mention how the SGS has a research on uranium mining impacts on Native people, and we were wondering if you can elaborate a bit on that, or because when we were looking throughout the website, we were trying to see like what information is already out there for the public to see, and it was a bit difficult to see. Like there was kind of like Princeton's like nuclear websites, and then there was like Princeton's like land acknowledgements, and they weren't, we couldn't find much overlap of like, this is like the impact that the nuclear science at Princeton had on communities. So yes, we were wondering if we can elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, So I think we need to make a couple of things clear. One is that the entire colonization of the land that we call the United States, was an act of violence against our indigenous peoples. And so we have to start with that acknowledgement, right? The indigenous communities of what we call the Americas did not ask the Europeans to come. They did not say, oh, we have all this empty land, come and work here, come and live here, come and build your cities and, build, roads and bridges and all the other things and factories and all the other things. They were not asked, they were not invited. They came. And they came and they stayed, and a lot of it was by force and violence. And it wasn't all military force and violence, there were all kinds of violences that were at work. And so the process of colonization in that sense is always a violent process. And the encounter between the West, as it calls itself, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, even the name of it is a European name, right? So there's no way of avoiding that fact. And so one can begin by saying, so what makes Princeton special? The entire project that is the United States, Canada, Mexico, and so on, is all one great act of 500 years and more of violence against the indigenous. Okay? And so it's within that context that one has to begin to ask these questions. The second point I think that I'd like to make is that when you ask about the responsibility of Princeton and it's as an institution and the people that are part of it, I think that you have to ask the question more broadly than what is its responsibility to the indigenous. Because as you may know now, the first, I think it was 9 presidents of Princeton owned enslaved peoples. And there are records of slave auctions on what is now the Princeton campus. And we're only now beginning to struggle and recognize some of that experience. And we are far away from acknowledging fully the implications and consequences and responsibilities of that experience. Similarly, it's worth thinking about that Princeton's endowment goes back to monies that were given to it and land that was given to it by the British rulers of what was then pre-American, pre-United States, because the university is older than the United States as a republic. Right? And it's also worth thinking about that many of the students that came in those early years actually had their fortunes built upon the enslavement of African Americans. And in some cases, we know indigenous people are also enslaved. And so there is all of that recognition also that needs to be built into it. The very ground and the walls carry that history with them. And even the name, Princeton, the town of the prince. This is a republic. There are no kings, queens, and princes, but it's still Princeton. The issues I think that we have to grapple with are about what happens with long-lived institutions in societies that evolve. And that evolution is always through struggle and contestation, and sometimes direct conflict. And so institutions have to try and make their way through these historical processes as best they can, because institutions, after all, are only people organized in particular ways of interdependency with each other and the world outside. And so Princeton is only now beginning to struggle with these kinds of experiences and historical processes. And as you may know, Princeton didn't admit women students until 1969. I mean, can you imagine that there were no women students in the first more than 200 years of the university? And in the more than 250 years of the university, we've only had one woman president of the university. And every single president of the university has been white. Yeah. And so, there are many, many issues that the university is, as a community of people, with each generation that passes through it, that's what becomes the institution. These multiple generations that are connected together by this place and these ideas and the work that they do, struggle with their time. And so, yes, it carries all of these responsibilities of the terrible past and the future that it does, because, Princeton has investments in fossil fuel companies, which means that we are in part responsible for profiting of the process that is destroying the climate. But we make money from that destruction because we invest in the companies that produce fossil fuels that make climate change. So we have people at Princeton who do research on how terrible climate change is. And the university makes money from the fact that we are contributing to that process of making climate change by supporting fossil fuel companies. But this is about the struggle that is taking place, about we shouldn't be doing this kind of profit making from that. Similarly, about profit making from many other things that we now see, but people before did not see. And so I think one of the things that we're talking about now with the indigenous is that the modern movement for the recognition and rights of indigenous peoples in the United States and elsewhere came at about the same time as the movement for an understanding of the rights of women, the modern women's movement, the modern environmental movement, the modern movement for the rights of LGBTQ people, that all of these came in the 1960s and the 1970s through struggle by people in all of these communities saying, look, we are here. We are human, just like you, and we have the right to be heard and the right to respect and dignity and equality. So deal with it. And we're only beginning to think about how all of that is to happen, even at Princeton. And so, you're right to ask these questions about, what is the responsibility that Princeton owns? But I think the first place to ask this question is not from Princeton. It's to ask all the people in these communities, say, what do you want from Princeton? Right? It's not for Princeton to say, oh, this is what we owe you, right? It shouldn't be for Princeton to decide, right? That, we'll write you a check, now go away. Or, we'll name a building after you and that's enough, right? It should be the people and the communities and the ways of living and the ways of thinking that are contesting what Princeton has done in the past and what others have done in the past, to hold Princeton to account and to say, this is what you owe us. We will tell you, we will send you the bill, right? It's for us to decide, but that we will have to have a conversation so that we agree about what's happened, so that we can help you understand what the world looks like from our perspective. What our experience have been while you were building big, beautiful buildings and great libraries and creating wonderful scholarship. This is the price that we had to pay so that you could do this. This is what happened to us. So now let's talk about how to tell the story of both of those things. Okay? And so it can't be for Princeton to decide what its responsibility is. I think it has to be an encounter, a dialogue, a contestation, because it won't be easy. Both sides will have their own views and they will have to think it through together about what exactly happened, how to tell a better, more full story about what this experience has been for as many people that were involved in various ways as we can possibly tell. But this story, we have to understand, will never be complete. And because so many of the people who were hurt are no longer here. And so many of the people who did the hurting are no longer here. So they can't explain, they can't speak for themselves anymore. And part of the role of a university and the role of scholarship and understanding and thinking and reading and writing is to try and think about how to tell their story, right? In a way that is honest and as truthful and as respectful as possible. And so that's part of what, you know, the Nuclear Princeton course is trying to do. And that is part of what other efforts now at the university through trying to support Indigenous studies, like we now have been supporting African American studies, because there didn't used to be a Department of African American Studies, right? It had to be created out of this struggle to say, look, this is important. These experiences and voices and ways of thinking matter. So there's a constant evolving, dynamic, contested, contentious struggle that takes place. And so it's not about, you know, one side or the other, just saying, this is what happened, this is what you owe, or this is what we are owed. It has to be done through this process of struggle and contention and learning and understanding and evolving as best we can.
For sure, yes. I think so. The next question we want to ask is, like, do you think there's a correlation between denuclearization and then decolonization?
So there are scholars and ways of thinking that connect denuclearization and decolonization, but these are done in complex ways because it depends on what do you mean by denuclearization and what do you mean by decolonization. And these are not terms where, you know, everybody agrees on what these words mean and what these concepts mean. Again, you know, these are ideas and ways of thinking about the world and the historical experience and the practices of people in the past, today, and into the future. Especially when we think about decolonization and denuclearization, it means that we accept that there has been colonization and there has been nuclearization, and that we're trying to think about how to undo them in various ways. But we also know that that you can't really undo what has happened, right? Because it happened. So you're never going to say, well, we're going to go back to a time where it never happened. It's happened. You can't, in that sense, you can't undo it, right? You have to learn how to grow past it and how to build on it as best you can, given that this has happened, and how to tell the story of what happened, how to deal with the consequences of what happened, but you're never really past it. So there's never really a kind of going backwards to an earlier time. We can only move forwards through the process. And so when we think about decolonization and denuclearization, we're also imagining a world on the other side of colonization and on the other side of nuclearization, that at some stage they'll be over, right? And the world will not be defined by those words anymore as active processes. That colonization will be a story we tell about the past, and nuclearization will be a story we tell about the past. And there, you know, it depends on what you mean by the past and whose past. Because if colonization has made you into who you are, then is it ever actually past? Right? Can you imagine trying to decolonize the United States when it tells the story of, you know, the colonists as heroes? When it's all about the 13 colonies? When it's about the War of Independence and about the westward expansion? I mean, what is the American story once it has been decolonized? What is the story of denuclearization when we have now spread a layer of radioactive material basically all over the planet? You can find it almost everywhere. Because when the countries with nuclear weapons started testing nuclear weapons, they tested them above ground so that you could see what was happening. And when these exploded, they took dirt and water and soil and sand and everything and made them radioactive. And along with the parts of the nuclear material inside the bomb, they spread it into the atmosphere. And it spread all over the world until it fell back down. And now there are scientists that can find traces of that radioactivity almost everywhere in the world, because it was carried across the atmosphere all over the world and fell back. And so there is this idea of what is called the Anthropocene. That, like previous geological ages, like the Eocene and things that go back to the origin of the Earth, we now live in a geological age, but it is the geological age where human beings define the geology of the world, because we actually have left a mark across the world in the very chemistry of the world itself. That even if all human beings disappeared, people from some other place in the universe who came, they'd be able to look and dig in the rock, if they were geologists, and find this layer of artificial radioactivity, and they would know somebody was here who did these things. And that was us, humankind. And so in that sense, you can never denuclearize the planet, because we have left this mark, this radioactive stain on the world that will be there on the timescale of hundreds of thousands and millions of years. And so is that what we mean by nuclearization, denuclearization? When there is no radioactive stain in the world that humankind made, will we have reached denuclearization then? It depends what you mean. Or are we just talking about getting rid of nuclear weapons? Even if we got rid of all nuclear weapons today, all the waste from the uranium mining in the lands of the indigenous peoples and elsewhere, it wasn't only mined in the land of indigenous people, and all the nuclear waste that is still waiting for a place to be put. You know, that's going to be sitting around. And in the US, the laws and rules require that nuclear waste, especially very radioactive nuclear waste, has to be kept out of the environment so that it doesn't get into the soil and the air and the water for hundreds of thousands of years. That's longer than all of human history. So we have to be mindful of this for a future that is longer than the entire time that we have of our own past. So, you know, it may as well be forever. So in that sense, you can't really imagine denuclearization that deals with that unless you have a clearer sense of what we mean. And it may be that we will never actually decolonize or denuclearize the world. We will just have to grapple with the fact, like we do with the legacy of enslavement or the legacy of patriarchy, right? That the oppression of women by men throughout human history is just part of the human experience. And we have to try and say, yes, that's how it was. We know better now. And we're still trying to think about how to make it better going forward. In the same way that, yes, there was colonialism, there was conquest, there was oppression, there was violence, there was environmental destruction. But now we think we know better, and we're going to try and move forward with that sensibility of the kind of terrible things that human beings can do to other human beings. And similarly with denuclearization, that yes, we can do this to each other and to the world, and it tells us something about who we are. And we have to live with that and move forward, fully aware and holding that knowledge and not trying to hide from what that tells us about who we are. I mean, maybe that's what decolonization and denuclearization means, to hold on to these truths about what human society is capable of doing. In the same way that, you know, we have to remember that, you know, it was possible for the Nazis in Germany to think it was okay to use giant gas chambers and concentration camps to kill millions of people just because they were Jewish or gypsies or gays or communists or whatever, that it was okay. Right? And the idea that people could think like this is just shocking to us now. In the same way that thinking that what, you know, the US military and settlers did to Native American communities, and what the Spanish and others did to Native American communities in South America and Central America, etc., and what people did in Africa and elsewhere, that these are all parts of what human beings can do, right? And we should hold on to this knowledge and make sure that we keep it in mind as we think about how we deal with today and how we go forward into the future. Perhaps that's what decolonization and denuclearization really means, to not forget.
Yes, also I really loved that response. And I guess to follow up with that, we were wondering, kind of returning back to the SGS and the International Panel of Fissile Materials, we were wondering if there is any research that's going, or like what type of research is going into the impact that nuclear weaponry and just material has on communities such as indigenous communities, and also just the general how do you see the future of the SGS and the International Panel of Fissile Materials going?
So the International Panel of Fissile Materials, so we started it in 2006 by bringing together experts and colleagues, scientists, diplomats, other kinds of expertise to try and help all of us understand the problem of the material from which nuclear weapons are made. And the first thing was to try and understand how much of this material is there in the world. Okay? So we were trying to focus on how much is in the world and who made it and where it is, what are they doing with it, and what could be done with it to try and get rid of it and the process of making it and using it. So we don't really deal with uranium mining because the mining of uranium doesn't actually make the material from which, it's not the material from which nuclear weapons are made. So we only focus on the actual process for making the fissile material being the material that actually has the nuclear chain reaction that supports nuclear weapons and allows them to explode. So that's where we begin. Otherwise, the problem becomes very large. And so what we tried to think about is where we could focus where there had been not enough focus. And so, there are people who think about uranium mining and its impact and its chemistry and its geology and its biology and so on, but that's not our expertise. And so, because we're not geologists or biologists or historians or anthropologists, and it would be presumptuous of to say, well, now we're going to go do this, as if suddenly we can acquire all this knowledge and experience and perspective just like that. But what we do understand is the material of which nuclear weapons are actually made and the processes around that and going forward. And so that's what we tried to organize. And because it's an international problem, right? We tried to bring together people from all the countries that have these kinds of materials and have the capacity to make them. And so we ended up with people from originally 18 countries, because the biggest collections of this material and the biggest places for making them are in the United States, Russia, Britain, France, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, and then, on a smaller scale, a few other countries like Japan. And so our focus hasn't been on what we call the full chain from the beginning, which is the mining of uranium, all the way to the disposal of the nuclear waste into a final repository at the end. We just took a chunk of it that we could actually focus on because that was where we had some knowledge and experience and expertise to bring. And this is part of the choice that scholarship always has to make, that even if you know that this is the full scale of the problem, you can't do it all. Okay? What you can do is try and realize that there are ways of thinking about specific parts of the problem that you can contribute to. And you have to respect the colleagues who are working on other parts of the problem and have their perspectives on dealing with that. And so we've not done work on uranium mining as part of the International Panel on Fissile Materials. We know about the problems of uranium mining. Yeah, but that's not our area of expertise or research. Like we know about other parts of the problem that are connected together, but those are not part, we don't focus, for example, on the health effects of nuclear activities on workers or communities or environment, because that's not our area of expertise. Right? So we focus on where it is that we could create ideas and create new information and options that would help the process of understanding what needs to be done in our part where we had something to add. And for other parts, we look to other colleagues who have other kinds of expertise and other areas of interest to say, well, you know, tell us what you found over there. And I think that's part of how scholarship works, that, you know, physicists shouldn't be telling historians how to do history, right? But when historians come to physicists and say, look, this is something that we think you should know, we should pay attention, right? As opposed to say, if I'm not doing this, then it's not important, right? And that's, I think, sometimes the problem with scholarship, that it has in the effort to try and be innovative, to have new ideas, to create new knowledge, you have to be very focused and be able to think very deep about specifics. And that sometimes means that you assume that nothing else matters. And I think one of the things that we believe in is that we have to be respectful of the ideas and perspectives of other people who work on these kinds of problems. And when they find things, then we should be willing to listen and learn from them, and hope that we have ideas and information that we can offer them to say, look, this is what we've been able to think of, and this is what we've been able to find out. So perhaps you might find this of interest and of use to you. So one of the things that we've been doing at SGS is, and as part of the International Panel on Fissile Material, is that when you look to see who's on the panel, for example, you'll find that they're not all university people, right? They're not all professors and so on. There are people with experience in government, because they bring a perspective of how things work inside the government on these issues that are important. We have people who are not in universities or in government, but are actually activists who are fighting to try and change policies because they have a different perspective on these kinds of things. And we try to have people that cross generations so that you can see the difference that somebody who learned how to think about these things in the 70s and the 80s, you know, like myself, and people who've learned to think about it in the last 10 years, you can see the difference, and we can learn from each other about this. We also try, and as I said, to have, it's an international panel, so we try and learn from people in South Korea and in India and in Pakistan and in other parts of the world. So it's not just the perspective from the United States or the perspective from Princeton or the perspective from Europe, right? We have, you know, members of the panel who are from Iran, and we have from South Africa and from Brazil, so that, you know, we can see how these problems look from their perspective also. And so it is an attempt to try and see the problem from different viewpoints and different experiences and different ways of knowing. But even with all of that, you can't try and do all of it, because then it becomes just too large a problem. And that's part of the compromise of scholarship that you have to make, that all the things that you learn, you can't write into one paper, right? Otherwise, every paper would be an encyclopedia. So you have to have, you know, this is a beginning, this is a middle, this is an end, and you just have to know how inadequate it is given all the things that are still not covered in what you say and what you write and what you understand, and be open to those things still being there and say, yes, I understand that they're there, and, you know, be respectful of that fact.
For sure. I think we're reaching like the 5 o'clock mark. Would you be willing to answer one last question?
Certainly.
Okay, sure. So for future generations and people interested in learning more about nuclear science like us, what message would you give us? And what message would you give Nuclear Princeton, and like what type of things would you want them to, what type of projects would you want them to pursue in the future?
Again, I think it's not for me to tell people what projects to pursue. I think I'm happy to have a conversation with you where, if you come to say, here are some things that I'm trying to understand, some things that concern me, things that I don't know, would like to know. Can we talk about those? And then perhaps in that dialogue, we can find a way of asking a question or a focus for something that speaks to your interests, speaks to what it is that you think you're searching for, that might help you focus that search in some way that you find interesting and useful. So that's the role, in my opinion, of a teacher. My goal is not to say, this is what you should do. My goal is to have a conversation with you where I can help you better articulate, in my own limited way, ways of thinking that you're trying to find out how to develop, right? But the impulse has to come from you wanting to know how to better understand something that you're struggling with, something you'd like to know more about. Is it about a part of the world that you wish you've understood better? I might be able to suggest, well, you might read these books. You might think about these kinds of questions as a way to think about that part of the world that might not have occurred to you. You might ask about, I'm interested in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Well, we can talk about that and trying to think about how to turn your interest in that into something that you could do research on that might help you better understand and develop your interest. And I think that's the goal of, teachers. Our goal is to help you walk along the path that you're trying to find, as opposed to give you, like a GPS, turn left, turn right, go straight, stop, right? That's not, I believe, how teaching works, right? So I think it's much more of a conversation about trying to help you find and better articulate what is it that you might be thinking of, but you just don't have the experience or the knowledge or the words yet to be able to specify the kind of thing that you're actually trying to grasp at. So that's where I think, I think what I would encourage Nuclear Princeton to do would be to reach out across campus, right? Look at what people are doing, right? Look at what all the faculty are doing. Look at what all the graduate students are doing. Graduate students at Princeton are working on all kinds of really interesting things, right? And they're also trying to explore, and they have advisors to help them, but they're advising, right? They're not telling them what to do, they're advising them. And then it's for the student to decide how to try and move forward on that. And then bring their ideas back and say, well, this is what I think I understand. Well, let's talk about that. So I think I would encourage you to kind of look as broadly across campus as possible. Look for interesting talks and events and faculty. Look at what they're doing, look at what they're writing, look at what they're saying, and ask, well, that's interesting, or that's not interesting. I would never have thought of that. Let me try and find out more. And then write to them. Seek a conversation, right? And you're not saying, tell me what to do. You're saying, tell me what you're doing. Because this is what I'm trying to understand. And perhaps I can understand that better by talking to you, right? So I think that's what I would encourage Nuclear Princeton to do, to take what it is that they're interested in, what brought you to the Nuclear Princeton class, and try and think about, well, where can I now take this conversation? Who can I have this conversation with across campus? So that's what I would encourage you to do.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Mian, for your time and today, and like agreeing with this interview. We truly appreciate it. And yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Zara. It's been my privilege to talk to you. Thank you for taking so much time and thinking of such great questions. And if you want to talk some more, like I said, just send me an email and we can talk privately about other things that you might be interested in talking about that are connected to what you've been learning in the Nuclear Princeton class, and other things that you think it will be interesting for us to have a conversation about.
Sure.
Good. That sounds wonderful. We'll definitely reach out if we come across anything.
Okay. So take care.